Football fandom has always been an intensely tribal phenomenon, a traditional source of homosocial bonding, usually predicated on regional pride and rivalries with other regional groups. Of course, following football or playing the game is no longer viewed as an exclusively male pursuit, but the game's darker half, the violent side of fandom, known as football hooliganism, has always been an almost entirely male activity. Having strong ties to youth subcultures, hooliganism progressed from being associated with the 1970s skinhead movement through to the casual scene of the 1980s. It's the late 1980s hooligan that Alan Clarke's film examines, and one that's been remembered across a variety of films and TV shows with an oddly valorized nostalgia. Perhaps the impetus for this revivalism was Nick Love's 2004 film, The Football Factory. Love would later go on to remake the film in a way that jettisoned Clarke's subtle critique in favour of bombast and blunder. Love's film helped to cement lead actor Danny Dyer's geezer persona, and in 2006, Dyer presented The Real Football Factories for the Bravo channel, a show that was perfunctorily critical of the violence associated with hooliganism and more interested in lionising the key figures in the various firms, with Dyer barking out sociological soundbites in vitriolic tones. This aligned the show with the then burgeoning genre of the true crime biography, where criminals and street fighters were examined by a gaze that was problematically sensationalist, leading to these books and their corresponding visual media being labelled hooligan porn. This trend was explicitly exploited in 2008 when Dyer presented Danny Dyer's Deadliest Men, again for Bravo. It was the increased popularity of cable TV channels such as Bravo and the internet that was instrumental in this outpouring of salacious material. Clarke's film, whilst often touted as a forerunner to such films and shows, is anything but lurid. Placed centre forward within the film is Clive Bexy Bissell, a young and upwardly mobile estate agent. From the off, it's clear that Bexy has a foot in the world of the middle class with his job and his new build home, yet remains firmly rooted in the working class environment of his youth, retaining a room in his parents' house on a council estate. He speaks with an unashamedly regionally working class accent and, most importantly, has a taste for extreme violence. This last, the film is keen to illustrate, is by no means a trait that is exclusive to its working class antagonists. The film demonstrates how the violence adopted by Bexy and his contemporaries is a tool of identity formation. However, there are two distinct reasons for adopting violence within these groups. Firstly, the working class hooligans use violence to attain a sense of achievement and prestige that is not readily available to those who, unlike Bexy, have a foot on the white-collar career ladder. In this sense, the film overtly critiques the upward mobility that was so prominently encouraged within the Thatcher era. The 1980s saw an increase of new build, privately owned estates, and a drive to encourage council tenants to buy their rental homes they were living in via the Right to Buy scheme. Whilst the Conservative government claimed these measures encouraged domestic stability and social standing, they were part of larger measures that attempted to lessen the state's responsibility in the lives of its citizens and to emphasise the importance of individuality over community. The new estates did not have the relational identity that was built up through the close-knit communities living on council estates, and this point is apparent in the scenes that take place on Bexy's private estate and the estates of his contemporaries such as Simon, where there is little evidence of a sense of community. By contrast, when Bexy visits his parents' home on a council estate, the people are outside and children are playing in the streets. The Thatcherite drive towards materialism and competition is directly paralleled in the hooligan fraternities. These gangs are appropriately called firms, suggesting both the structural hierarchy of the competition of the corporation and the organisation at work in masterminding their tear-ups. Bexy's crew are part of a larger family of units, a corporation, all from a particular part of London, and all West Ham supporters. This crew are called the Intercity Crew, or ICC, and they're a fictionalised rendition of the Intercity firm, the ICF, the real-life West Ham firm, who took their name from the fact that rail cards for young adults offering cheap fares on intercity trains opened up the potential for travel to other cities and violent confrontations with rival firms. Even this factor is Thatcherite in essence, the opening up of the violence market and the potential for competition and domination. It's clear to see how young working class men derive a sense of prestige from travelling across the country, leaving their mark on their rivals, quite literally in most cases. This is true of members of Bexy's firm. Whilst we're privy to the details of Bexy's life, we're not afforded the same of most of the other members. We do see Bexy pay for a rail ticket for the youngest member of his firm, Youssef, who's still at school and lives in a council flat with his brother. His inclusion within the ICC offers Youssef opportunities that would otherwise be absent from his life. However, not all of the firm subscribe to the aspirational element of the violence. Simon and Beef, part of the larger group, but members of a subgroup called the Hornchurch Crew, are middle class, and the violence is for them an attempt at masculine assertion. As Sean Best suggests, there are many young men who are fully incorporated into mainstream economy and society that use the context of football to adopt a rough working class style and exaggerate their rough behaviour as a consequence of a wider crisis of masculinity. As the Hornchurch Crew pick up Beef from his family home in Simon's BMW, which was very much a status symbol at that time, we see his mother wave him off, and he's thoroughly ridiculed for this act, especially by the two more overtly working class members of the crew, Billy and JT. As the ICC's rivalry with two other firms, a Birmingham crew led by Obo and a rival London crew led by Yeti, intensifies, both Simon and Beef start to lose their bottle, and Bexy responds by asserting his own masculinity. Indeed, there's a correspondence within the film, at least, between overt masculinity and a propensity for violence. When the ICC travel to Birmingham to clash with Obo's crew, Youssef is separated from the gang and is cornered by Obo, who slashes his face with the ubiquitous Stanley knife. Bexy responds to this by ambushing Obo as he enters his house, pinning him to the floor and slashing both of his eyes with his own blade, demonstrating that if violence is indeed a marker of masculine prowess, then he's willing to go further than his rivalries to compete fiercely in the marketplace of violence. The fact that masculinity is so closely aligned with violent acts ensures it is entirely toxic. Any man demonstrating anything but hypermasculine behaviour is denigrated. He's called a girl and spoken to and about in an effeminate tone of voice. Clearly, to be female or a feminine male is a negative position in a world where violence and aggression are markers of strength and assumed to be entirely masculine traits. The only women we see are Bexy's wife, Sue, and the strippers in the pubs the firm frequent. Women, for the aggressive male, have either domestic or sexual value and nothing more. While Sue is scathing of Bexy's violence, he does attempt to keep it quite separate from his life in suburbia. After Yeti's crew vandalise Bexy's car, one of his crew, Trig, visits Bexy at home to express his anger and his desire for revenge. Bexy sees him to the door and refuses to be drawn on the matter. However, we then see Bexy retreat to his room at his parents' house after work the next day, where he keeps a suitcase filled with weapons. He repeatedly attacks a pillow with a baton, screaming Yeti over and over. This is the space in which Bexy's psychopathy initially bloomed. Amongst the photos of footballers on his walls, there are newspaper clippings detailing hooligan exploits that we assume relate to his. So it's a space that naturally he returns to in order to play out this psychodrama. It's Clarke's representations of violence that sets his films apart from other thematically similar offerings. The Football Factories and other films of its ilk sensationalizes its violent scenes, overlaying them with dramatic music and dire explanatory voiceovers. Some scenes are even framed with casual humour, as though a baseball bat across a rival's head is little more than slapstick. Clarke's film offers three key moments of violence that are intentionally repulsive and devoid of music. Clarke never uses soundtrack, instead opting for absolute diegetic realism. The scene in which Yusef is slashed by Obo is given tension by its relative quietness. Taking place immediately after the two films clash, Yusef is chased down a side street where the only noises are those of passing traffic. Obo is calm as he approaches the boy, whilst Yusef, inexperienced as he is, trembles, perhaps expecting little more than a beating. The Stanley knife is drawn slowly across Yusef's cheek, leaving a deep, lengthy wound at a screaming boy. The second scene sees Obo returning home after the clash. He walks with an almost victorious swagger, opens his front door, and is then ambushed by Bexy and Snowy, who followed him home. As he's pinned to the floor, Obo snarls Bexy, perhaps not knowing exactly how far his rival is willing to go in seeking revenge for Yusef. Bexy brandishes his own Stanley knife and regains his composure before methodically slashing Obo. The broadcast version of the film was fairly heavily cut, and in this censored version, we see Bexy make two slashing motions. Many viewers assumed he'd slashed the corners of Obo's mouth, widening the aperture in what's variously known as a Glasgow or a Chelsea grin. However, in the restored director's cut, we see the truth is far more grisly. Bexy actually slashes both of Obo's eyes, puncturing them and blinding him. The scene takes place in the silence found on housing estates at night, and it closes with Obo's harrowing screams. The third scene sees Bexy's reduced crew, the Hornchurch boys having bottled out, attack Yeti's crew in their local pub. Again, the BBC broadcast version of this clash softened the violence, resulted in muted blows and elements of the violence cut out completely. In the restored version, we see Bexy drag Yeti out of the pub, where he administers a prolonged beating, and as Yeti tries to crawl away, Bexy seemingly inserts his Stanley knife into Yeti's backside. As with Clarke's other representations of violence, the only sounds are diegetic. This scene ends with Yeti pulling out a pistol and shooting an incredulous Bexy. The film would turn out to be Clarke's final project. He died of lung cancer the following year and had plans to break into the US film industry. Often criminally absent from discussions of British social realism, his films and plays deserve the acclaim offered to Mike Leigh and Ken Loach, and his influence is found in the contemporary social realist films emanating from Shane Meadows, Andrea Arnold, and even Ben Wheatley.